Okay, great. So I will start off. So hi, everyone. My name is Jason Nurse, and I am an academic at the University of Kent. And what I'm going to talk to you today about, as Malcolm mentioned, is SherLOCKED, which is a game that has been created by two of my undergraduate students, actually. So that's pretty good, Alex Jaffray and Conor. And this game was created really on the back of one of my research, one of my, I guess, project proposals. I'm basically trying to deal with the issue of what we call kind of emergency online learning that was generally caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. So to start off, right. So as I mentioned just now, one of the realities is that, so this was taken, this photo is from January 2020. So for many of us, it's a long time ago. The world has really kind of gone through massive changes since January 2020. And when this article came out, the WHO basically coming out and saying coronavirus declared global health emergency by WHO. And then, everyone started to consider, and everyone that didn't hear about it before really started to think about, well, what's coronavirus? What's this thing? Why is it global? How will it impact me? And so on. And unfortunately, the reality is that if we jump forward quite a bit to today, there have been just a mind-blowing number of cases, a mind-blowing number of deaths across the world. And some countries, of course, as we all know, are still kind of, in many ways, knee-deep in it, in the context of still trying to battle the pandemic as much as possible, and still trying to battle to receive vaccines and so on. So one of the big things about this really is that it has really changed society as we know it. COVID-19 has really massively changed society as we know it, in terms of cases, deaths, and of course now we're trying to vaccinate the world as quickly as possible to try to counteract these, this massive influx in deaths. So there's a kind of a key context here that I want to focus on, especially within the context of this research. And that key context is education. And it was good to kind of this panel in particular focus, or well, this session in particular focus on education. And to kind of what I want to emphasize here, for instance, is at the University of Kent, when this also, which is where I'm based, when this all started to happen, university, just like many other universities, kind of very quickly went to scrapping face-to-face teaching and basically rolled out everything online. And that was the kind of early days of platforms just as Zoom and Teams and so on. So initially, I remember using Skype quite a bit to engage with my students. And then, of course, we started to see this kind of eventually kind of ramping up across the UK, in that many other universities, once again, looking at shifting online. A number of kind of the bigger universities, and then as time went on, a number of the smaller universities as well, basically trying to basically switch everything online. So no more face-to-face, no more big gatherings, everything just moving online. And then gradually, it kind of course, was across the world, in that many universities across the world basically the same thing, shutting things down, shutting down campuses, and kind of nudging students to online teaching, to online learning. And this is kind of the real trend that we saw. And this was a trend that was largely motivated by, or some people would say primarily motivated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So one of the things that I quickly recognized actually as this was happening is this reality that, well, all of us have been kind of pushed towards online learning. And similarly, organizations, industry has been pushed to remote working. All of us have had to, in some way, shape, or fashion, do remote working for potentially quite a long time. But there's a real question in my mind about online learning, and I know that online learning has existed for quite a long time. But I think one of the big differences, really, with the COVID-19 pandemic is this reality of what is actually, I thought was novel, but what I found out was actually termed emergency online learning. And this is one of the articles that I kind of read in detail to find out more about what is emergency online learning and what are the challenges surrounding it. So based on this article, it was very clear that emergency online learning, this kind of push to all of a sudden, face-to-face quite normally, and then all of a sudden switch to online learning. Lectures need to be online, engagement needs to be online. it kind of introduced a number of challenges which I don't think had been covered in traditional online learning, or hadn't actually been approached properly, because the idea of online learning is that everyone would have time to acclimatize, people would be given the technologies to acclimatize, and lessons would be planned in such a way so that for online learning and so on, which is a very different scenario than if one day you're in lecture halls and the next day you have to be kind of speaking to a screen or learning only based on electronic content. And the kind of advance from this, this article kind of highlighted a number of kind of the key challenges that they thought were particularly novel when it comes to emergency online learning. And they mentioned things such as kind of situational and environmental challenges. So for example, concentration difficulties living at home and learning at home, stress balancing life, financial hardship, sudden life changes, also educational specific challenges, like for example, online learning being particularly difficult, lack of support from academic resources, workload increase, distractions during class, and so on. So, and of course, another big one being unfamiliarity with online technologies. And things like platforms such as Teams and Zoom in particular. Teams, for example, cause many headaches, and for some universities probably still causes a lot of headaches in terms of getting students to engage and being able to share and access content and so on. And then, of course, from an emotional perspective, things like lack of motivation from students, negative emotions in terms of engaging with online content and engaging with lectures via these kind of electronic means. And the photo I have on the right is really kind of one of the classic examples. And those of you that are in the room that are educators or even students, but particularly educators, one of the big differences, and this is kind of one of my daily screens where I'm having a meeting with students or I'm lecturing students, and the reality is that all I am seeing is these initials. I'm seeing just initials, and I'm hoping that someone's there. I'm hoping that someone's listening, but I have no insight into that whatsoever. Maybe a student responds, maybe a student types something to the chat, and that's kind of the extent of whether I know if the student is paying attention or not, which is a very different dynamic to being in a lecture hall, being in the classroom, being able to walk around, to engage, to at least see that students are looking at you and kind of absorbing the content. It's a very different scenario, they're a very different setup. So the real research question that drove this work was kind of, can applying gamification in a cybersecurity module help in this kind of emergency online learning scenario? And I mean, it's really great that, before the speaker before kind of mentioned a bit about gamification, but for me, this was particularly interesting because gamification has been for quite a long time mentioned time and time again. It has been shown to be potentially one of the kind of key benefits of or it has been shown as quite advantageous when it comes to engaging students with content in a better or different way. And of course, there's been many games trying to do exactly this, specifically even in the security space. So the kind of key novelty of this work, like I said, there have been many games trying to do gamification, but the key novelty of this work is there were three things we were targeting. One was the fact that now we're actually looking at potentially using gamification to support a module, especially in this emergency online learning context, which, as I mentioned before, is potentially, or in many ways, as the research article just showed, that is actually very different to the traditional uses of gamification, even in the context of security, where you have plenty of time, you can plan things, you can even run gamification in labs, so you actually have students there. This is kind of fully and completely online. So that was one of the big differences about this study. The second difference was from a kind of my review of the literature, it was very clear that there are many, of course, games that try to do that kind of focus on cybersecurity, but kind of the overall majority of them focus on technical aspects. They focus on gamifying the very technical aspects of security, so things like catch the flag exercises, more things are much more technical, kind of finding bugs, leaderboards, this kind of stuff. They're very much more on the technical side. So one of the key things in this bit of work was, well, actually, can we try to focus a little bit more on gamifying the socio-technical side of security? That it's an important part of security, but unfortunately, it's not a part of security that's often focused on. And then the last topic, really looking at a larger sample size. So once again, looking at the literature, it was very clear that in most scenarios, the sample size was between maybe at best 50, maybe 60, at lowest, maybe around 20 or so. So the sample size was in general quite small. Of course, there were some studies that probably one or two studies that went a bit higher, but the point is here that generally speaking, the sample size was quite small, and we were hoping that so that the cohort that was part of this module in particular was, if I remember correctly, a little around 400 students. So there were quite a number of students. So really the hope is here we can actually leverage the engagement of the students to actually kind of test the use of gamification in more detail. So the methodology we actually applied in this work was, firstly, we looked at kind of requirements engineering. So we basically tried to find out what requirements are needed and what do we need to build. Because of course, just building a game and building a game just because we think this is the right game that needs to be built is not ever the way to go about doing things. So the first thing was kind of trying to define a number of requirements based on literature, based on engagement, based on whatever we could find, and then trying to kind of build a game that would actually suit and address these requirements, and of course consider the context of what we were teaching here at our university. The second one was game development. Of course, this is the actual building of the game. And like I said, this was really done by the two students I mentioned at the beginning. So kind of massive props to them. And that's not something I'll cover in detail in this presentation. And then the last one being kind of the evaluation. So the idea is, the very traditional kind of design and testing life cycle almost. And that was the kind of methodology that we applied to doing this research. So now let me talk a little bit about the requirements engineering and the game design. So what we did was we looked across the literature, both focusing on gamification generally, but also focusing on gamification in cyber and information security, and trying to identify key things that might be important or that might be of interest. We found, for example, that especially in security, role-playing games seem to be often well received. So we thought, okay, well, maybe role-playing games might be an area we focus on. We also looked at kind of one of the realities that came out from some of the research studies was that strong, compelling narrative. So the narrative, the kind of context of the game actually is really, really important to actually having students or players basically immersed in the game. And the idea is that the more immersed you get them, the more beneficial it will be for them in the context of their learning. And then the last one being, this is just a sample of 3 that you can find more in the paper. And then the last one looking at kind of good feedback and strong feedback. And the idea here is that, there've been a number of games, and we saw this actually coming up. There's a number of games that the student plays, and basically it just tells them you've got this wrong. It does, or you've got this right. It doesn't tell them you've got this wrong. Here is what you need to do next. It just kind of, and it's basically missing that feedback loop, and that's something that we want to ensure that we incorporated in the game that we built. To mention that this content for this game was based on an introduction to cybersecurity module that was offered to final year students at the University of Kent here in the UK, where I am based. So let's jump into the actual game itself. So the game's name was SherLOCKED, which I think was a quite cool name. Once again, full credit to my students. And the idea was that it was kind of a detective theme based, and this is where the idea of a narrative came in. So as you can see on screen, it's kind of a two-down detective theme base. What we went for is a very kind of retro style in terms of the game, because we found that this was actually quite very much preferred in the context of, for whatever reason, it seems like retro games are quite in at the moment for undergraduate students, or at least we found this in the context of this game and our kind of prior research. And we basically, the context was that it's a 2D detective theme-based game, and the point is that you assume the role of the detective, and you've been called in to support a user because their home has been hacked or attacked. And the point is that what you're supposed to do is basically walk around the home, find different clues. The clues link to questions. The questions relate to security and basically security components of the module. So the point is that the goal is to answer enough questions correctly so that you actually solve, quote unquote, solve the case. And that's the kind of general aim. So you can see here on screen, these are kind of two quick examples. So on the left, this is the detective, and detective is really, this is the dialogue between the detective and the user on the right. So the detective is basically saying, hey, you must be Ginny, you called my office about a hacking, and there's a little bit of a dialogue in the game itself. And then on the right, you can see kind of the kind of very retro 2D function where you can use, you know, the usual arrow keys to go up, down, left, right. You can go up to items. You can press E, and your E basically shows you like a magnifying glass almost. It pops up and it shows you some questions, and that's how you actually engage with the game. And if you answer questions, actually, I'll go on to that in the next slide. So the point here is that you have, so one of the things, like I said, is a narrative. The other one I'll focus on with the context of this presentation is feedback. So what we found was using, of course, informative feedback is basically paramount. It's really, really important. And what we decided to do is we integrated two things. We integrated something called intuition, and we created something called reputation. And intuition basically helps track your kind of experience points or your progress towards answering questions correctly. And reputation, the idea there is that actually helps measure the number of questions you're answering wrong. So it helps track your mistakes, more or less. And on screen, you can see this is two examples of a question that someone got right versus a question that someone got wrong. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you see the person has answered correctly about kind of security risk management lifecycle. And then they answer correctly, so it lights up in green, and they get a prompt saying, that's it, time to move on. And then you could actually see, if you kind of squint a little bit, that on the top left-hand corner in the intuition bar, they've actually gotten a little bit more life or a little bit more experience points. On the right side of the screen, this presents the scenario where a user has actually gotten, or one of the students have actually gotten the answer incorrectly. And here you see a response given to them, and the feedback is blast. I should try and recall the goals of the CIA triad. And this is sort of nudging the student towards thinking more about what they need to go and reflect on, and the context of the CIA triad, so confidentiality, integrity, availability. And in the context here, in their reputation bar, what would happen is that their reputation would basically take a hit. So the reputation would go down. So they start with a full reputation bar, which goes down depending on how many questions they get wrong. And they start with an empty intuition bar, which goes up depending on the number of questions that they get correct. In terms of progress reporting on leaderboards, that's one of the other big things that we try to implement. So if you receive full intuition, and that essentially means that you've won the case and that you've kind of done well. And the idea here is that if you fill up the intuition bar, so if you answer enough questions correctly, you basically get the screen on the left saying correct deductions, you know, they scored 8 out of 10. It shows your time, and then it says case closed, and it allows you to return to the menu, and then from the menu you can actually go to other levels. So you can kind of, and I should mention that levels are also linked to rooms. So when you finish one room, you can basically, you'll get this prompt, and then you go back to the menu level, and that directs you to another level, which is another room. On the right-hand side, you see an example of actually if the student has lost all of their, so basically they've answered too many questions incorrectly, so they've lost all their reputation, and basically they get a message basically saying that they've been fired. Because if you remember the context and the narrative of the game, they have been recruited. So I always get the names mixed up. I think Ginny has recruited Sherry. I can't remember. I will try to remember. The point is that the detective is fired because they were recruited to do a job. They were recruited to help solve the hacking, and they couldn't do it, so therefore they were fired. So that was the kind of general narrative. But once again, you can see the case time also being mentioned. And this case time and the scores are important because this case time and the scores help actually kind of create this idea of a leaderboard. So the point is that, and we got students to actually do this, the point is that when the student is finished, they could actually post they basically a screenshot of what they received, their scores, and then from that we could actually go ahead and generate something like a leaderboard. So in terms of the evaluation and what we actually did next, what we did was the core question we posed was kind of to what extent, and of course going back to the beginning of my presentation, to what extent could SherLOCKED actually help in this emergency online learning scenario, especially in the context of cybersecurity modules? So what we did was we set up a kind of a user study with this study being run within the context of AA class. one of the live classes that I run in this security module. So we had basically a pre-test questionnaire where we answer questions about students' experience, students' understanding of certain topics, students' confidence in their understanding of certain topics. And then we basically allow students to play the game. So so we started the lecture, which I should have mentioned, it's a 1 hour lecture. We started the lecture. I gave a little bit of an introduction about what's going to happen in the lecture. Students were given the pre-test questionnaire. Then they were allowed 30 minutes to actually play the game. They were briefed a bit, of course, on the game and how it works. And then we actually did a post-test questionnaire. So a very simple, potentially not the most effective, but a very simple and not the most effective in terms of a longitudinal bit of research, but at least it would give us a little bit of a flavor in terms of whether students would think this is a good idea, whether they're positive, negatives, and so on. So in terms of our findings, what did we find and how relevant was it? So firstly, like I would have mentioned earlier, the cohort was about 400 students. Only 198 actually attended that lecture, which once again gives you a flavor for how difficult it is to do online learning. I should mention that all of the lectures are actually recorded, so students could have gone back, of course, at any point or watch the recording at any point. But the point is, we already started off with half of the students not being present. And then secondly, what we noticed was that even out of the 198 that turned up, only 112 actually did the pre and post test and actually played the game. So they did the kind of complete study. In terms of the stats, in terms of what we found in general, there were some things that were actually very, very encouraging. So we found that most students actually felt the game actually increased their confidence in certain topics, as you can see on screen. That was actually really, really positive because it was clear that students were nudged almost to thinking about what they need to learn more or where the areas in which their confidence has grown. And one thing we did find out actually quite clearly is that before playing the game, students had certain confidence levels, and that actually grew after the students played the game. So that was really great to see. And that was kind of almost a nudge in terms of course, potentially in terms of two things. One, that the game was actually helping students remember certain topics, but also maybe the game actually helped students recognize that maybe they were better at certain topics than they thought they were. And then also I want to kind of highlight, of course, the more qualitative findings in terms of what did we find, what did students say. One thing that was probably the striking thing for us, especially in the context of our overall research, in that some students basically said, as is kind of shown here, the game and engagement with the game was much more informative than reading notes, and for some students actually much more informative than actually sitting down and just watching a recording, which is one of the big things that was different in the context of this work and what we were trying to figure out in terms of the use of this type of a game. For some of the students, it reinforced their knowledge, so that was also great to see. Probably another thing being, and this is a kind of a hint for other people building such games, try to make things as fun as possible. So one thing we did was we included some kind of hilarious responses. We asked some students, what's in the CIA triad? What are the key, what the C and the I and the A stands for? And maybe for the C, we put something that was ridiculous, cabbage or something. And the point is that it's important to get a good balance between, the serious nature of the game, but also making it still fun for students, especially cohorts like this. And also another key point being, what we recognize from previous games is that some games were just games and then they tacked on security or they tacked on a different topic. And one of the key things that we found, which was actually really great, was one student said it, it makes sense to teach cybersecurity concepts in a detective setting because it makes it feel more in place. And I think this was a really, really key point, and this is something that actually I found based on the initial work was actually a weakness of some other kind of bits of research apply gamification, because they kind of miss that context. But of course, there's always things that need to be improved on. So one student, for example, said the gameplay was quite boring, just walk around to an object, interact, go to the next object, not much of a reward. So there's clearly much more stuff that can be done there to make the game much more engaging. So thank you very much for listening. I believe that is my 25 minutes. And yeah, if there are any questions, feel free to let me know.